Thank you to Megan and Renee and all the other organizers. Thank you for inviting me. And it's just really exciting to see more people talking about specifications grading. So I'm really excited to be part of this. So I am at Indiana University, Purdue University, Columbus, or IUPUC. We're part of the Indiana University system. So I'm kind of right in the middle of Indiana, in Columbus, about an hour south of Indianapolis, if you know the Midwest. Got my email there, and then you can also find me on Twitter. My email is mendezju@iupuc.edu. And if you want to find me on Twitter, I'm at Julie M. Mendez. So I want to talk a little bit about, I just want to briefly kind of give an overview of how I think about specs grading, explain some of my teaching context, talk broadly about how I generally plan to use specs grading in different courses, and then give some examples from a few different courses that I've taught recently, and then finally give some thoughts about how using specs grading has kind of maybe changed how I've thought about teaching and what I see as some benefits of it, and what are some things that I'm still working on with my courses. So in specifications grading, all of the assignments are graded either pass or fail based on whether a certain set of requirements or specifications are met. And there's usually some way for students to resubmit assignments or redo assessments. And then the final course grade is determined by how many of the assignments were successfully completed. And so usually the higher grades require either more assignments or more complex assignments, or maybe some assignments being done at some kind of higher level. I've been teaching at IUPUC for 6 years. I teach in an undergraduate mechanical engineering program. I teach several different courses. I typically teach second year through fourth year courses, but I did teach one freshman course recently. And courses are pretty small, so usually 15 to 20 students. And I teach several different courses, so I see the same cohort of students semester after semester. So I get to know them, and I don't have to try to explain specifications grading over and over again, or try to sell it to them after the first course that they do with me. I first came across specifications grading about 5 years ago. And I was getting ready to teach a course in MATLAB. So it was going to be some computer programming and applying some their knowledge from previous programming course to a different program. And I thought specs grading would work well for that, because I had really had trouble grading some things when I was teaching the course previously, because there's sometimes, if you make some errors, your program just doesn't work. So it is really hard to figure out how many points is that? Because some of it's right, but it didn't work at all. So I thought that was going to be a really good fit for that class. And so as I was preparing for that over the summer, it just seemed like a really great idea to do specifications grading. And when I think something is a good idea, I really want to go all in. So I was going to teach 3 courses that fall, and I turned them all into specs grading. So I just went all in on 3 courses. And so since then, I've used specs grading in nearly every course I've taught for the last 5 years. So I think I've used it in 13 different classes. So a lot of those have been lecture problem-based kind of classes. I've also done some labs, and I've also done a few design courses that are more project-based. I've mostly taught traditional face-to-face courses, but I have taught a couple courses in a blended format a few times. That was about 75% asynchronous online, and then the rest in person face-to-face. And then during the last year, I've taught courses fully synchronous on Zoom and a few other courses, a combination of synchronous and asynchronous online. Okay, for a lot of the courses that I teach, most of the course outcomes have to do with being able to solve certain types of problems or to apply particular concepts. And those are the kind of courses where traditionally we'd have a few large exams that would make up most of the course grade. And so when I think about doing specs grading in a course like that, I typically start by looking at the course outcomes. So the course outcomes for all my courses are set by our program because our program is offered on 2 different campuses. So to provide some consistency across different sections of the course, we have set course outcomes. So I start with those, and some of those are already written in a way that could be directly assessed, but some of them are more broad, like more general course goals. So based on those outcomes, I try to draft a list of measurable outcomes or standards. And I've kind of settled on about 15 being the right number for some of my courses. So for example, I teach a thermodynamics course, which is a second year course, and it's usually one of the first mechanical engineering courses that the students take. So some of the standards or measurable outcomes I would use are determine the difference between closed systems and open systems, and apply the first law of thermodynamics to open systems at steady state. So once I have that list, I try to identify problems or write problems that would correspond to each of those. In an ideal world, I would have all those written out ahead of time to make sure that I assess all of these outcomes. But sometimes that isn't possible. Like recently, I had a couple classes where I was just writing the problems week by week because that's what I had time to do. But ideally, I would write out some problems to make sure that I knew how I was going to assess all of those outcomes. And then I would write the specifications for each of these kind of problems. So for example, on the difference between the closed system and open system, that would be like a short answer question where I would describe some kind of system, and then the students would have to just write a short answer response. And to get it correct, they would have to correctly identify if it was a closed system or an open system, and then correctly explain their reasoning for that choice. The question about the first law of thermodynamics would be a problem. So they'd have to show all their work on the problem, and then the specifications that I used recently were correctly simplify the energy balance equation, use appropriate sign convention, and correctly retrieve required property data. So those were kind of what I saw as some of like the main pieces that you needed to show to do the problem correctly. Yeah, so ideally I'd have a list of all these standards, at least an idea of what problems might look like, and then some idea of what the specifications were going to be for each. So then what I typically do then is then figure out what order are we going to do the different topics in the course and come up with a rough schedule for the semester so I know what's going on week by week. And then that helps me figure out if I have too many standards and we're not going to have time to do them all, or maybe while I was identifying problems, I figured out that the way I worded the standard, I really can't assess it. So I revise that list of standards. And so usually these problems or questions that we're using on these standards, I just call them quizzes. So I do a lot of quizzes that are just one problem or one short answer question. So I'll have one quiz associated with each of these standards. I used a flipped learning approach in all my classes. So the student's first exposure to a topic is outside of class time through reading or watching videos. And then our class time is used for discussion and working on problems. So the other main type of assignment I usually have in my classes is some kind of pre-class assignment where students read and watch videos and answer some questions. And those are due before class starts. So those I don't grade for correctness. I'd grade those pass or no pass. So that it gets a pass if the assignment gets turned in before class starts and the student has a reasonable attempt to be correct. So as long as they showed some effort and didn't write, I don't know, or something like that. So those are, so I generally have quizzes and I generally have pre-class assignments, and depending on what the actual course is, there may be some other types of assignments too. And so then after I know what assignments are going to be in the course and how many of each type of assignments there are, I figure out what the grade bundles are going to be. So what are the requirements to get an A or a B, et cetera. Many of the courses I teach are prerequisites for other courses, and students have to have a grade of C- or better for it to count toward their degree. So I kind of set C as like that's, I think about what level do they need to be at for me to feel comfortable with them earning a C. So I usually try to figure out the C level requirements first. And then I usually set the A requirements as completing nearly everything, and then set the B requirements somewhere between C and A. And then the requirements for D would be somewhat less than C. And then a grade of F would come up if the D requirements are not met. So that's generally kind of how I approach a kind of problem-based course, which we have pretty frequently in engineering. If I'm doing a like design course that's based around a big project or a laboratory course, I have kind of a similar approach. But those courses, instead of being based on problems, usually revolve around completing lab experiments or meeting benchmarks for a team project. I'm going to talk a little bit later about a design course. But for example, for a lab course that I co-taught recently, our course was built around 14 experiments. So each experiment had a pre-lab assignment and a lab report. And the specifications on the pre-lab assignment were just that it had to be turned in before the lab period and that the student made a reasonable attempt to be. So they weren't graded on correctness, more for effort and for doing it before the lab. And then each lab report had a set of specifications. A lot of the specifications were general and applied to each report. So it was describing what kind of things needed to be in each section of the report. And then some of the reports had some specific requirements, like a certain type of result needed to be shown, or there were specific questions that needed to be discussed in the lab report. So for the lab course, there were just the lab reports and the pre-lab assignments. So the grade was basically determined by how many lab reports were done successfully. Excuse me. So this was the grade requirements for this lab course. So A was getting all of the lab reports done and meeting the requirements on those. And then just one fewer report was one letter down. We have plus or minus grades in our grading system. So the pre-lab assignments were used to either add a plus. If they did nearly all the pre-labs, they could put a plus on this letter. And then if they did, I think it was less than half of the pre-labs, and there'd be a minus onto this grade. So this one class I want to talk about a lot is thermodynamics. So this is kind of where I've done the most revising in terms of how I've been using specs grading in this class. I taught this course once before in a traditional grading scheme. And then the first time that I used specs grading in this course, it was in a traditional face-to-face course. I've also taught this course in a blended format, which is about 70% online. And I've taught it in a couple of 6-week summer sessions also. So prior to using specs grading in the course, I used a traditional points-based grading system with exams, homework, quizzes, and then there was a group design project. And so this was our percentage breakdown for the assignment weighting. And this is pretty typical of what I used in a lot of classes before specs grading, or that I'd see colleagues using. Yeah, so we had some exams, there was some homework and quizzes, and then this class had a team project. Okay, so I taught it once with a traditional kind of grading. So the first time I used specs grading in this course, I came up with 33 standards or outcomes. So each one of those 33 corresponded to one quiz. 18 of those I thought were the most important part of the course. So 18 of those 33 standards were specified as core standards, or I called them learning targets in this iteration of the class. And so those 18 core targets had to be passed to get a grade of C or better. And then the other assignments that I had was, we still had this group design project. We had pre-class reading and responding to questions. Those pre-class assignments were just graded pass or no pass based on whether it was on time and whether the student made a reasonable attempt to be correct. Okay, and okay. So I had 33 of these quiz questions. And so we did all these quizzes in class. The class met twice a week. So usually one day per week, we do quizzes toward the end of class. And so I let students retry quiz questions as many times as they wanted. So if they wanted to retry it again the next week, they could. So I know, like, traditionally in specifications grading, there's the idea of tokens. So students get some limited number of times they can revise and resubmit an assignment. And I think that makes sense for things like essays or other types of assignments that you might do outside of class time. But for like a timed in-class kind of quiz type assignment, I thought some students might need more than some. I couldn't even think of a good arbitrary number of revisions. So I kind of let them do as many times as they needed. So they could retry until they were happy or until the course ended, because we do have to stop the course and turn in grades. And so every time we did a quiz, it would be cumulative. So I'd have new questions and I would have previous versions of the old questions. So I would give this, hand out pages with several questions, and then students got to pick which ones they wanted to attempt. So it was just, so everybody got the questions, they could just decide which ones they needed to do. And if they were already happy with their score on a certain problem, they just didn't have to do it. So at this point, I was grading quizzes and projects with a 4-level rubric. So I was using the EMRN rubric, which is based off the EMRF rubric. So I put a version of this in the syllabus to explain to the students kind of how their quiz scores, or how their quizzes would be scored. So E would be excellent. So that would be like a near perfect solution, only trivial errors. Meets expectations for M. The solution would show that the student understands the concept, but there is something that needs to be fixed or expanded on. So E and M would correspond to passing. And then R for needs revision means it's clear that there's some partial understanding, but they're not all the way there. And then N for not enough evidence would mean it's left blank, or there's many errors. And so R and N would correspond to not passing. So that's what I was using for quizzes, and then for this team project. Okay, so then the final course grade was based on how many quizzes earned a passing score, how many quizzes earned an E for excellent score, the scores on the report and presentation for the design project. And so this is a grade checklist that I gave the students in this class. So they could kind of check off as they earned passing scores on different assignments, so they could get an idea of where they were. So they had to pass the core learning target quizzes to get to a C. They had to get some number of E for excellent scores to get a B or higher. They had to get an E score on either the report or the presentation of the design project in order to get an A. And then some number of pre-class assignments needed to be completed to earn different letter grades. And so then here, if they earned everything in one letter and then one category for the next higher letter, then they get a plus. So like if they met all the C requirements and one of the B requirements, they have a C plus. If they met all of the requirements except one, so like let's say they met all the B requirements except for the pre-class work, then they'd have a B minus. So that's how I did the plus and minus on that. And then an F was if the D requirements were met. Okay, so at this point, I taught the course in a traditional grading exam format, and then taught the course with specs grading. And so what I did was I went back through the exams from the traditional grading course, and I went through and tried to pick out the problems that matched up with these learning targets in the specs grading course. And so I went through those and I graded them on the 4-level rubric so I could compare what those scores looked like. So there were 6 of my 33 targets that I'd actually assessed previously. So I think that should have told me I had way too many targets, which I will explain, yes, that I had way too many. So there were 6 of these standards that I had assessed in the previous course giving traditional exams. And so I compared passing scores. So anything that was a M meets expectations or higher. So I compared what that would have looked like in the previous class and then in the class where we use specs grading. And then, the 4 that have asterisks on them were core targets. So those had to be completed. So that's why you see that everybody in the specs grading class eventually passed that. Because all the students did pass the course. So they did better than the previous year's course eventually. on some of those targets. And so what I found was some of the topics we were doing toward the end of the course, so like the auto, diesel, and dual cycles is at the end of the course because it requires knowledge from a lot of the other course topics. And so you see that a lot of students in the traditional exams did pretty well on that. But then in the specs grading course, not many students passed that one. And I think it's because they were spending their time going back to those earlier topics, which they really needed to master those earlier topics to be able to do those more complicated problems that are applications of all the previous course content. Then the next time I taught this course was in a blended format. So about so I taught in a blended format of about 70% online, the rest face-to-face in person. And so we typically met in person about twice a month for 2 hours. So some of our quizzes we did in person, like in the previous year's course, but then some of the quizzes were done online through the learning management system. So the biggest change I made in that next iteration was significantly reducing the number of standards and quizzes. So I had 33 that first year. I've been tweaking them every year, but I've usually had between 15 to 18 for this course. And when I've had a higher number, some of those were short answer kind of things and not big problems. So that, let's see, so the second time I did specs grading, when we had a hybrid course or a blended course, this is a grade checklist from that course. So many fewer quizzes. I tried this time, I did not have the core learning target requirement, so they just had to pass any 11 quizzes to get a C, but I was still using the 4-level EM/RN rubric, so there was still a requirement for a certain number of E scores to get a B or higher. And then we still had a report and a presentation. I believe it was just they had to pass those. Okay. I did want to compare how students did in this blended course compared to the course that was completely face-to-face. So I compared some of the quizzes. So since we did have like 15 standards that were the same from the previous year, so I compared those. So these are all quizzes that were done in person in class. So similar conditions. And then the ones that had the asterisks on them are the ones that had to be passed for a grade of C or better when the class was all face-to-face. So all those, that's why all the students passed to those. So what I did notice when I took away the core designation, so just passing any of the quizzes to get to a C or better. So I did see there are students that didn't master some of the early material, but then they did, more of them did better on the topics that were toward the end of the course. So the different thermodynamic cycles that we usually do at the end of the course. Okay, so I've taught the course a couple times since then, and I've revised the list of standards a little bit. I don't have the project in this course anymore because it was removed from our syllabus as a requirement, so I took it out of my course. I also stopped using the 4-level rubric and started grading everything as either pass or no pass. There were some things where I was having trouble distinguishing between excellent and meets expectations. And then there was really, it didn't matter. There was no distinction between R and N in the final grade. So I started trying grading everything just pass or no pass. So where I have very recently, let's see. These were just some more, these were the quizzes that were done online. So I think there was some similar results as the other quizzes. So where I've recently ended up with on this course is I went back to requiring some core quizzes or targets to be passed. So I'm primarily basing the final grade on the quizzes. So to get a C, all of the core quizzes have to be passed, and then some number of additional quizzes to get a B or an A. So I've really simplified the number of assignments, and then kind of simplified how it looks like in determining the final grade. So most of the grade is based on these quizzes, and then a plus or a minus is going to depend on pre-class assignments and some other small assignments. So in the blended course, I did have some discussion board assignments and some other small online assignments that I've been revising, so they haven't been exactly the same every year. But all of those things are graded pass or no pass based on whether they were turned in by the deadline and whether there was just a reasonable attempt to be correct. So a plus was put on the base grade if they did nearly all of those other assignments. And then I usually set the minus to be about less than half of however many of those other smaller assignments there are. I want to talk a little bit about a couple other courses. I've also taught this other second year course, Design, Ethics, and Entrepreneurship. So this is where we introduce the engineering design process. And there's a team project that we basically start in the first week of the class, and students work to develop some original products. Okay, so the first time I taught this course, I had a grade checklist. So we had pre-class reading and responding to questions. There were some individual homework assignments because so much of this was team-based. I wanted to have some individual assignments. So there were some individual homework assignments that were directly related to their project. We had an ethics case study assignment. All students had to keep an individual design notebook to document their contributions to the project. And the number of quality entries that they had in their notebook at the end of the semester went into the final grade determination. And I gave them a description of what quality meant. And then the project had a presentation and a report that was done with their team. And so again, on this, if they met all the requirements, so let's say you met all the requirements for a B and one of the requirements for an A, that would be a B plus. If you met all the requirements for a B except one, then that would be a B minus. I was using the 4-level EMRN rubric to grade the ethics case study and the design project report and presentation. And then the pre-class work and homework was pass or no pass if they turned it in and made a reasonable attempt on it. So also in this class, I started to try to have fewer assignments, and I did eventually move to grading everything as pass or no pass. There were some things I found difficult to distinguish between meets and exceeds expectations. And then I also stopped counting the entries in the notebook, and just gave them some guidelines on what was supposed to be in the notebook, and graded that as pass or no pass also. So, so when I taught this course most recently about a year ago, so this was our grade requirements. So, so I kind of set C as kind of what their minimum needed to be. So they had to do their team's project report, and then they needed to do their individual design notebook, and then more requirements for B and A. And then we had plus or minus depending on how many of the pre-class assignments and how many of the individual homework assignments they did. So if they did nearly all of them, there was a plus. If they did less than about half of them, it was a minus. The ethics case study assignment was a reasonably short writing assignment. So students were given 3 different scenarios, and they got to choose one to respond to. And those were graded pass or no pass. And so the specifications on that assignment were that they addressed all the questions that were posed in their chosen scenario, that the discussion considers relevant portions of an engineering code of ethics, and then they cite specific sections of an engineering code of ethics. And then the design notebook, instead of counting how many entries they had, it was just graded pass or no pass, depending on if they showed their contribution to the team's project, and that they dated and initialed every page. And then they also had to write a final reflection as the last entry in their notebook to reflect on the design process, how their team worked to get together, and what they learned from the project. The project report and the project presentation had probably like a page worth of specifications, especially for the report. It listed out what kinds of things needed to be included in each section. And then the presentation, the specifications for that were all the things that needed to be included in the presentation. And then there were also some requirements around general basic presentation skills, like that we could hear you in the classroom, and that the font on your slides was large enough to read, and things like that. Okay, and then I'm going to briefly talk about one other course. So I actually am finishing up this course this week. So it's a third-year course, Instrumentation and Measurement Systems. This is the first time I'm teaching this course, and due to the pandemic, this is fully online, and it's about half asynchronous and half synchronous. So this is a course that does require a lot of problem solving, so I'm primarily using quizzes for the grading. We ended up with 14 quizzes in this course. So I usually set the A level as like 1 fewer than however many quizzes we have. Occasionally, I set A as passing all the quizzes. And then we had pre-class assignments of reading and responding to questions, and those determined plus or minus onto the base grade. So in this class, so for example, one of the quizzes was about analyze models of 0, 1st, and 2nd order measurement systems. And okay, so this class was all online. So I had to write a lot more questions than in a face-to-face class. So I would write a lot of very similar questions and put them in a question bank in the learning management system. And then when a student would open the quiz, it would draw one question randomly from the question bank. So they'd see a question, and so they were expected to write the steady response output signal for a given signal. And then the specifications for this was that they had to correctly write the steady response output signal for the given measurement system. Okay, so I just want to kind of summarize some things. So moving to specs grading in all these classes has changed how I think about deadlines. So I kind of felt like when we give exams, some reasoning on the day we have the exam, but it's somewhat arbitrary because with specs grading, if a student doesn't get it right this week, they could try again later. And I've also had to think a lot about what are we assessing and how are we assessing it? Because at the beginning, I definitely tried to assess too many things and we didn't have time. Well, we somehow made time to do it all, but it was a lot of grading. Some students felt like it was overwhelming if they fell behind on passing quizzes. They had a lot to do to try to catch up. Some benefits that I found of using specs grading. I don't have an issue with having to write a makeup exam anymore. That was always something that was really difficult to have to write a similar exam, but a different exam. Now they just try a new version of the quiz. I find doing specs grading does take a lot of work for me up front in terms of planning out the number of assignments and what's going to be assessed. But then during the semester, I feel like the workload is a lot more evenly distributed instead of having to, it always took me a really long time to write an exam. It also took me a long time to grade an exam, and I don't even have that many students in my courses. It also spreads the workload for the students more evenly when I'm doing quizzes every week. Because I do observe them sometimes cramming for exams. So it forces them to spread that out a little bit. And then students are happy that they can earn better grades because they get to redo things. Some other challenges I found are writing the assignment specs for the first time, especially for a class I haven't taught before. So I've definitely had to kind of revise things as I've taught the same class over and over again. Sometimes it's hard to write questions that are similar but not exactly the same for the retries or for the classes where the quizzes are online. Because when the quizzes are online, I can't use the textbook problems, so I need to write new problems. So that can be time consuming and take some practice to write similar difficulty level, but not be the exact same problem. I do want to try to do some larger or more complex assessments, but I want to be careful about not having too many things that are called projects, because I know students sometimes feel overwhelmed when they have a lot of projects across multiple courses. I've also been trying to figure out what to do about smaller assignments. Like I really want students to read before class so that we can spend our class time ready to go and work on problems. I don't really want to weight those very heavily, but then some students won't do those assignments if there's not a lot of grade attached to it. So that's kind of a thing I'm struggling with, trying to sort out how that's going to work. And then I've put together a list of some references and some other papers. It's at go.iu.edu/3 capital M and capital Y. So those are case sensitive. Okay, so that was the end of what I had. So I think we can go to questions now.
Thank you so much, Julie, for your wonderful presentation. So I absolutely appreciate your effort trying to share the concrete examples, how you implement specifications into different types of course and delivery modes. And I hope our audience appreciate all the examples. Any questions from the audience?
Julie, Morris Jones here, electrical engineering. How do you handle weighting different concepts? Just give them more items in your list or whatever? Because, you know, semester projects usually carry 10 or 15% of a grade in traditional grading. And if I make it one of 6 items, I don't know how it ends up being the same, because you've got to have something to get them going. So there's a lot of little things at the beginning that they can feel like they've gotten into the thing. And so did you worry about the class weighting, or you just said, these are my CLOs, and as long as I've got them covered, we're done?
Yeah, that's a good question. So normally if it was something like, yeah, like a design, something that would be a big chunk of a percentage, I'd usually say that had to be done to get a C. So I usually require those kind of project reports to be done for a C. Yeah, I think that's it, because there'd sometimes be some, because I'm just thinking about the one, the design class that I talked about, because there were some individual assignments, but those didn't count for very much. And then there are some things that just weren't graded, like we do some design review kind of short presentations where each group would present on where they are and get some feedback, but that didn't count for a grade. They just came and did it.
Okay.
Thank you, Morris, for your questions. Does anyone else have any question for Julie, especially delivering specifications grading kind of design into a different teaching modes? Oh, Nuri has a hand raised up. Feel free to unmute your microphone and speak up for your question.
Hi, yes, thank you. Julie, I had a question about the, specification grading. There's a really, a lot of nice flexibility for the students, right? How did you integrate that into the pre-class assignments, right? The ones that have to be done before they come to class, because that feels like something that's kind of hard to make flexible.
Yeah, that is, I feel like, yeah, there isn't much flexibility there. So I usually say those are due like maybe the day before class, because I want time to read them before class. So I know where everybody's at. But then I do have a hard stop, like, because I usually have them turn those in electronically in the learning management system. So there's a hard stop when class starts. Because on those type of assignments, I don't, they're not kind of worthwhile if you do them after class. So that's kind of the one place where I don't really have any flexibility.
Thank you, Julie. We have a question in the chat. Mahima asked that, giving student credit for their class participation in specifications, kind of a specific activity is great, but what would you recommend, grading them?
Yeah, you could do like just pass or no pass and just define what you mean by participation, like whether that's they're there or that they tried something and turned it in. And then you could set, require a certain number of those for a certain grade.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else has any questions? I'm looking at the chat here too.
I have a question. So yeah, you're not the first person this quarter to tell us that they started with too many specifications and then they had to shrink it way down, and everyone seems to agree that like everyone wants to start with 50 and 16 is the correct number. So we've heard it a lot, and the things that it makes me think is, the same that anyone who hasn't done it yet thinks, oh, I want more refinement. I want more refinement. Does it bother you? Do you think it's problematic that with 16 specs, there's not as much refinement, especially, and again, a lot of people seem to agree that pass, no pass is really the way to go. Does that bug you that there's not as much refinement? Is that a problem? What's the deal with that? What do you think about that?
Can you explain what do you mean by refinement?
Yeah, each thing, there's like somehow 32 specs is twice as refined as 16 specs. You can see in more detail. And then also sort of like what Morris was asking, you don't just have a project that's pass fail, something as big as a project, you really kind of want like A or B or C or D or something like that. And I think your answer to his question was a very good one, but you don't sort of get that. Do you think there's a problem that the level of refinement for A, B, C, D that you get is only the number of things, and that within each thing, it's just pass, no pass, and there's no refinement?
Yeah, I have been kind of struggling with that because on things like a design report, I get good quality stuff, but then there's usually somebody who went like way above and beyond. I am kind of wrestling with are grades the right thing. I'm really interested that one of the talks later is going to be about ungrading, because that's something I'm kind of thinking about maybe trying. I don't think that answered your question, but that is kind of a thing I'm thinking about.
We have two hands raising, Pavi first and then Chris.
Yeah, hi, Julie. Thanks, first of all, because for the first time, I really truly understand what this is all about and how to approach it. So you really laid it out very, very nicely. So thank you for that. And I'm not a scientist, and a lot of this is kind of focused on science. So I'm a historian. So I have a lot of discussions and quizzes and then a final project. So I guess I just want some feedback. What I'm thinking here is that if I use specs grading and I basically require certain assignments to be completed for C, and what I'm seeing, just looking at my grade distribution. So I'm thinking, so I have a final project, but how about if, the students who really just only want to see, they don't even have to do the final project. I mean, because they can, meet some of the, if they do a certain number of discussions and they do a certain number of quizzes, then there is no final project. And because I get a lot of these final projects, and some of them are just really lousy. And students really don't put the effort into them. And it seems like it's a waste of their time and it's a waste of my time. So what are your thoughts on that, of just kind of integrating that idea into the classes?
Yeah, I think it might depend on what your course outcomes are. And is it a thing that needs to be demonstrated through a project, or is there other ways to demonstrate knowledge of that area? Because I don't do a lot of other than the courses that are built around design. So yeah, I probably think, how are we best, how can the students best demonstrate that they can do those outcomes?
Right. Okay. Yeah. And I see, because I think that's also from QM Quality Matters. You really start with those learning outcomes, and thinking that also requires some rethinking of their learning outcomes and how to connect the assignments. So, all right. But thank you for that insight, though.
Thank you. And we have Chris, and then we also have a question that raised by Jill in the chat. So Chris, feel free to ask your question, and then the next one will be Jill.
Okay, thank you. So this is actually, I think this is an extension of what Dennis was asking about refinement, in terms of I'm thinking of a lot of and I can't decide if my question is about how do you lower the number of course objectives. So I teach physics. I'm like, wait, instead of having a separate objective for learning Newton's first law and second law and third law, do I just say, oh, you have to learn Newton's laws? But then what if they actually only master 2 of the 3? Is that enough to pass? So that's where I'm kind of struggling, because I feel like when I have my students do kind of daily quizzes, and a lot of times there's that getting them from that 80% to 90% understanding. I really like that, but I feel like you're going to lose that if I just go to pass fail. A lot of these students will be like, okay, yeah, they get the general concept and they totally are wrong about some specific details, but that's going to go away if I do pass fail. So how do you come to peace with that, or how do you decide that that's okay to not get that last 10% of understanding or something?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm not really sure what an answer.
And any other trainer can jump in as well.
I'm going to say, Kate, do you want to jump in with your having the 3 level, where that you get a little more of being able to do that? If Kate hears me, there she is.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, I mean, I was thinking too, for pass, not pass, it's not just that the students do it or they don't do it. Often you have a rubric attached to that assignment. So you have specifications for very specific things that you want the students to demonstrate. And so if they are still meeting those, and then ultimately that leads to a pass on the assignment, then I would say you're not cutting anything out, and you're still measuring something that they are demonstrating, right? That they're learning. I don't know if that addresses exactly the question, but.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is you can still be communicating to them what they do and do not know. So even if you can have 2 students that both pass, but you're communicating to them that one of them, you're like, oh yeah, you hit all the marks, and the other one you communicated to them, you passed, but you only hit 8 out of the 10 marks or something like that within your rubric.
Right. And then they can track those. Sorry, go ahead, Julie.
No, I was just going to say you can decide what pass is. So pass could be all the items or all those things.
Yeah, what Renee was getting at with the 3-level system is if you want to have them demonstrate like a level of competency, then that you can have like a 70% is like a low pass, and then like a 90% would be a high pass. So then you can also delineate that further.
So we have another question from Gio. Gio, you want to just unmute your microphone and ask your question?
So I teach applied calculus classes, not majors. They have to take it. I'm wondering if the distribution of grades changes any compared to a non-specs course. I would say most of my students would probably aim for the C.
Yeah, so I don't have a whole lot of like non-specs courses to like directly compare, and then I feel like there's a lot of other factors
Sure.
that contribute to their grades, but I guess I try to make sure that whatever the requirements for a C are, that I feel like they'd be okay to go take the next class.
Yeah.
So I think that's what I would think. Just figure out what you are okay with at a C, and then go from there.
Yeah, it seems like for me the learning outcomes or whatever is something I really need to focus on, and I'm still struggling with that. How to measure that they've achieved the learning outcomes, because I'm used to, okay, here's a problem, do this problem.
Thank you again for the questions. Any other questions from the audience for Julie before we end today's session?
I can say just something for Jill's. I teach organic chemistry, which is notoriously the class that no one wants to take, and just has to. And most people don't just aim for a C. I don't know if that's because I have a lot of pre-med students, so by default they will never aim for a C. But I've seen in both lecture and lab, the letter grades across the board go up because it's not the one and done anymore. There's chances to try again, and there's chances to learn from mistakes.
And you truly think that they've learned the material better?
I think so, and we're working on actual data.
Okay.
As soon as I can stop having to remake classes for pandemics.
Any other questions? This is a really nice session. We have a very interactive audience questions. And Julie, that also says how great your session was and really pumped this kind of interaction. So thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. And let's give Julie another round of applause. That was a really wonderful demonstration and presentation to show us how you actually implementing applications grading into teaching. So thank you, Julie, for your presentation. I hope you all have a wonderful week, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye.